When I was 20, I just made a big decision in my life. I worked up for months thinking about how I would frame this decision, present it to my family and my friends, but I decided to come out of the closet. This was not an easy decision for me. You work hours and hours trying to hide a piece of your identity, and then all of a sudden, you're faced with reality and you realize you need to present this change to everyone in your world. So I spent months and months thinking about, how am I gonna tell my mom? How am I gonna tell my dad? How am I gonna tell my best friends who didn't know and I had been lying to for years about who I was? And I spent hours and hours working it up. Oh, okay, this is how I'll frame it. This is how I'll talk about it. This is how I can, soften it for this family member who might not be so welcoming or open to it. And eventually, after months, I went and sat down, had a really frank conversation, and directly told them what in my life was changing, how it was changing, how it affected me and them, and what I'm looking forward to with the future. And I was so blessed to be welcomed with open arms. But the funniest thing of all this is after the conversation, reflecting back with my family, I realized I had focused so much on this piece of my changing identity, I didn't even talk about something else that they really cared about, which was that I had also tried bacon. And as a Jewish person, that was a really big deal. So, why am I talking to you about this personal story? It's because I think we all can relate to change. I've never used a clicker before, so I'm going to assume this is the button. Great. We all can relate. We're all little experts, especially over the past 2 years. Each and every one of us experienced massive amounts of change. We went through tons and tons of ups and downs. And I think what I'm hoping to share with you today is a little bit of learnings and lessons from that change, what that was like, what frameworks I used to help position change in work and in personal life, and also share a little bit of my story, so maybe it resonates with you. So I'm Elon, I go by he, him pronouns. I'm Jewish, I'm Canadian. As you heard, I had experience in startups, all the way to now I'm at Shopify, which is a whole different world. Then it still acts and thinks like a startup, but much bigger. And I got married in August, talk about big change. So let's go through a few personal or professional changes and explore them a little bit. So we have a fun one, getting a dog. If anyone here has a dog, raise your hand if you have a dog. Wow, product marketer, high correlation with having a dog. Great. I got a dog during the pandemic, like a lot of us might have, right at the start, and it was a huge lifestyle change. If you have kids, I'm sure that was an even bigger one. You kind of have to be home at a certain time. You have to make sure that you're aware of their needs, making sure that they're happy and healthy and well taken care of, and also maybe balancing some of your other life choices. Big change, but a fun one, a great one. Another big change is getting married. I mentioned I just got married. How do you change the way that you think about communicating with someone else who's sharing your life with you? How do your bank accounts change? How do these things change in your life that in a really meaningful way? There's changing things like habits. Some of us have habits that we want to improve upon and work to build. Some of us have habits we want to break. Habits are really challenging things to change and to break or to improve. It's because we get stuck in certain mindsets and we find patterns that give us dopamine or make us happy, and breaking those patterns is really challenging. April mentioned, the sales rep who is really in love with the old deck. That's such a common thing that we've all come across. They're used to it, they're happy, and breaking that habit is really hard to change. There's changing jobs. The reality of today is that a lot of us have either recently gone through this or are going to go through this, whether it's chosen or not chosen. Onboarding and offboarding, these are massive changes in our professional life that can be really challenging, can be really daunting. Thinking about how we position that change to our colleagues when we're telling them we're maybe leaving or when we're joining, how do we position ourselves and our value that we hope to provide? These are big changes that we as product marketers will go through in our careers. There's also changing jobs on a much more televised scale. There's definitely members of the political ecosystem who are more excited maybe about change, and those would be more liberal maybe politicians, and maybe those who are less excited about change. And we've seen different leaders approach change in the limelight very differently. And I think it's really interesting to learn about like how do they position the change to their communities and to their audiences. What can we pull from that, and how can we learn about how to represent yourself in a certain way? And then there's, talking about political leaders, there's change that's been spoked and built under a community that's looking for democracy. This is actually a picture from Tunisia, which was the first country during the Arab Spring to really think about, how do we drive as a community base, and they actually used Twitter a lot for this to drive change. And so why am I telling you all these stories and giving you all these examples? Really, it's about two things. One is building empathy that change is hard. Going through change is probably the hardest thing we'll have to do ourselves. And if we think about our audiences, whether the audience is sales reps, whether that audience is executives who are learning about the competitive positioning, whether that audience is end users of your product, being empathetic to each of their situations and needs is really important. The other reason is we often take our jobs incredibly seriously. Now, I'm a SaaS product marketer. I am not a heart surgeon. I am not trying to overthrow a government and create democracy. I often can be an anxious person. It gives me levity to think about the fact that, the changes we're making, while they seem like our whole world right now and in a moment, especially if the CEO is coming to you, the product marketer, especially if you're the only product marketer, I've had this happen. CEO comes and says, hey, you have to change this. Feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. Know that, there's no door that you can't walk back in through the other way or think about a little bit differently. So I want to be empathetic to us all that change is hard and it's hard to lead. So when I want to bring this back to how we embark upon change, migration in our own worlds, this is a not sexy topic, I'll be honest. I was like, how can I take the least sexy topic of change management and make it interesting? And so I think like applying personal stories and journeys as we go through this framework is going to be really helpful, and really framing it with empathy. So here's the framework that it's really simple and straightforward, but it might be something that helps you when you're facing a change that you have to lead, frame something up. So the first is, what is changing specifically? You need to understand, especially if we work with technical products, what is changing? What in the UI is changing? What in the messaging and the copy is changing? Really have clarity on what is changing. Who is it changing for? This comes down to audiences. We've talked a lot about that today. Who is facing this update? Who is getting access to a new feature? Who is going to be impacted the most by this change? What are the benefits of the change? What's the value? Maybe it's a unique value prop when you're selling a new product, or maybe it's finding benefits in a change that might be daunting for your audience or for your users. And then what are the options? I think this came up a few times today, but no one wants to be told you have to only have one option. You have to pick this toilet. It's always, as a user, as a buyer, you want to be presented with options. It's how our minds think. It's how we feel like we own a decision. So the first question of what is changing? We'll start with how you find out what is changing. Sometimes that starts at the CEO level. Maybe the CEO comes and says, hey, I don't like how this looks, or I don't like how we're building this feature. I don't like how we're positioning this feature. You have to recognize, okay, this is the leader of the company. How do I either push back or understand and work with this person to understand what's changing? Maybe it came through the CEO and worked its way down to product leaders, and then finance got involved. You need to start building a map of how this decision came to be. And this will come back into importance much later when you're building the story and the narrative around the change. Why was this something that came up? Whose idea was this? Was it yours, maybe? Who needs to be involved with this change? Change management has this framework thinking about things called a stakeholder map. Pretty much plot out your stakeholders, assign them a level of importance or urgency, and map out how you're going to think about communicating how you're approaching this back to these stakeholders. The next one, and I think as product marketers we do this every day, is really understand the why. So in a specific example, an organization I was working with, and I think we're all going to face this in the next year or over the past few years, we maybe did already, is cost cutting. Businesses are thinking about how am I containing the amount that I'm spending. And so if you're able to trace back to maybe it's grow revenue, reduce costs, optimize profit, what are the root reasons that this change is happening? And also, I've spoken to a few people already today who said they work with 6, 10 product teams. It's not always possible for us to be in the room every time a change is made, a decision is made. So being able to trace back the why and the who of a decision is really critical, and I always start there. The next is get clear on timelines. If you've worked with product managers or engineering teams, you know this is their least favorite topic, but build a flag mark, a point in time that you can point to say, we need to be able to make this decision at the state and make changes at a certain time. And that'll hold you accountable and the other stakeholders involved. And the final one is write it down. Jason actually started today talking about writing notes. I think writing these decisions down, writing what is changing down is so critical and often overlooked when you're in an executive level conversation, everyone's having the discussion. We work in, a lot of us in modern workplaces, there's not like a note taker taking agenda minutes necessarily. Write down the decisions that are being made and keep everyone accountable to them. We have to do it. As product marketers, we don't have a choice. We know that we wear 18 hats. Wear the hat of being the note taker and writing it down, because you're gonna be the one who has to hold people accountable to the decisions and the changes that were made. The next piece is, who is it changing for? So I mentioned a cost-cutting example. There's ways to communicate out to users for transactional conversations or messages that you need to send. So if they click a button, maybe they get an SMS. If they go through some workflow, maybe they get an email. So thinking about that example, there might be people who use those features and there might be people who don't. And there's gonna be people in the middle. I really would encourage you to break it down into clear groups. Who are the most impacted? Who are the least impacted? Maybe is there a middle group that you can evaluate? And the reason for doing this is because, especially if you work with a really large audience, you don't want to be messaging 2 million users about a change that none of them care about. That is not a great experience. If you got an email every time a plane had to replace a part because you were flying on that plane, but that plane was flying and landing at the same time, I think we'd all be pretty frustrated with Air Canada or other airlines. So understand who's impacted, who's not. That will really help guide your messaging. So again, once we know who are the different stakeholders, maybe the impacted or not, maybe it's looking at company, partners, users, so company being the brand that you maybe are working with or working for, partners being the ecosystem, maybe integration partners or service partners, and the end users being the consumers of your technology. What are the benefits for each of those groups? Within those groups, there might be segments: impacted, not impacted, adopted, not adopted. How does each of those groups get impacted by the change? And breaking this out will also help you prioritize in what order to send these communications, how to frame them, and understanding which is the most important and when to send it and how much time ahead would you need to communicate. So in this example, maybe we're reducing the amount of transactional interactions we're having, maybe because they're redundant for end users. So if we want to make sure that they understand that, and specifically that the group who's impacted by these redundant messages understands it, we need to narrow it down to who's sending out or getting redundant messages. And finally, the options. So we talked about this a little bit too. There's often going to be situations you're faced where there's only one option. There's only one migration choice you can make. You have to adopt our new purchasing technology or our new checkout. But in reality, and I think we talked about this before, there's always a decision to leave. There's a decision for status quo that a buyer or a user can always choose. And it's super interesting to hear about how the most common decision made is indecision. So framing up what each of these options are, what the benefits or challenges of these options might be, and how to action on it in a really clear way when you're managing a migration communication or a change, it also applies to launching features as well, is really critical. And so these things leading up to one another on their own, again, as product marketers, if you just did each one of these things, it wouldn't be valuable. The critical thing is to underpin this all with measurement and think about how at each of these phases you're going to plan for how to measure the success of whatever change, messaging, or migration you're running. So in one example, at the highest level, you might be thinking about retention. Is ARR going to change or MRR going to change as a result of this messaging and this communication going out? And how can you reduce that by targeting specific audiences and sending them specific benefits and actions that they can take? Maybe it's about driving adoption change, or even like getting really granular and looking at how many people click a certain button in an email to understand engagement and awareness of a change coming. All to say that we as product marketers know too well the challenges of measuring our success. And so start early thinking about how you're going to measure the success of this migration or this change, and who are the stakeholders and partners, like data maybe, or like your digital teams that will help you measure it. I really like this quote from Maya Angelou. If you can't change it, change your attitude. Coming back to what I spoke about earlier, change is hard. We all are going through it. We all have been through it. And the biggest thing that you can control is your expectations and the outcomes and the way that you frame things. So using this framework has helped me understand how, when I'm thinking about the end user who might be impacted by this really important feature change or by a decision we're making so that we can sustain our business, how can I frame it in a way that helps them change their attitude, that helps my team change their attitude? How can I change the expectation about what we're building in a way that helps deliver the most success for all of the different audiences involved? So again, I want to summarize. Thinking about change, we know it's hard, we know it's scary, but it can also be a force for incredible good. Think about what's changing, who is it changing for, what are the benefits, why is it changing, and what options exist, and then how to position them, and measure it, of course. So thank you. I'm honored to be here today. Excited to hear the next speakers.
Thanks, Elon. That was awesome. Awesome. Anyone from the audience want to ask the first question? Don't be shy. Don't be shy. There you go.
Classic last speaker before.
Right there. Yeah. No, you're.
How do you manage, like, if it's a time crunch and a top-down change management thing, and you don't, like, the product marketing team doesn't actually agree with that change? How do you deal within the internal stakeholders that we really don't need this change? How do you deal with that?
That's a great question. Let's break it down maybe. So the question was about if there's a change you don't agree with, how do you position it? And then also the urgency factor. So like it's a short time frame. So the first piece is you don't agree with a change. Now this also is something really relatable. Like I could relate to this too. Maybe someone's making a decision, but they're not on the ground floor understanding the working systems. So you have a narrow window, especially the more executive that this individual is, to get them data. At the end of the day, we know how much data drives decisions. If you can present a piece of data that shows that this decision or this change that's going to be made, let's say it's like changing your privacy approach to be super, super strict on compliance. If you can prove that making that decision is going to lead to a huge loss of revenue for your users really quickly, so gather that data and present it back, you might be able to buy time. You might be able to help them change their mind. So the first thing I would do is look for data and look for maybe someone who can be in their ear to support that decision. On the urgency side, again, it comes back to why is there urgency? Is it just because this executive thinks it really important, needs to happen today? And maybe that's a personality that you have to work with and help them prioritize. You know, we could do this today, or we could do this tomorrow, or this in a week. And which option would you prefer? So I think understanding what deliverables you can deliver within different timeframes and presenting that back would be a good strategy, but great question.
Great question. Okay, another one here. Referring to the change framework, what if there is no benefit? So example, price increases without additional features or benefits to the customer, timing, approach. Yeah, how would you handle that?
Yeah, it's tough. I think when there's no like clear benefit, you have to ask the question again. I go back to the why is this change being made? If it's not in the benefit of the users, it comes back to this previous question of like, one, should the change be made? And if you can't control or change that, then two, it's about finding a way to frame this change in a way that you can present some other options as benefits or other options in general. So, you know, this is a change that's happening. Being really clear and transparent about the why here, especially when there is no apparent benefit, is what you're going to help your audience build empathy with. So if you aren't able to articulate maybe the why, that gets even more challenging. But if you're able to take that first step of understand why this change is happening, and as much as you can be transparent with your user base or your audience, that's definitely how I would approach this in terms of being real. We're dealing with other humans on the other side of a marketing message. And if there's really no way to get to a benefit or a value, I think transparency is really key.
I love that. That's great. Having empathy and understanding the why. Yeah, awesome. How do you motivate team members when a top-down change means a lot of their past work and effort will be discarded?
Yeah, I think this is something we all felt. There was a really big moment in time in March 2020. Maybe you were working on like a big initiative, or you had just gone through a positioning reframe, and you're about to launch this new sales deck, and then everyone is facing this new daunting change, and the way you talk about even software has to change. So I think sometimes you can't control when a change is happening or that it's happening, and you have to throw out a lot of work that's been done. And I think, again, this is coming back to the ideas of recognizing that's the fast-moving pace of the world we work in, and framing it in a way of what are the benefits of going down this path, so your team understands, and how their work, even if it's not being used right now, gives super valuable context and will help in the future. So I think it's always challenging to work on something and then throw it out, but it's about framing the next thing as something really impactful and positive. But I would also love to hear in conversations in the break what other people would say to that question too.
Yeah, that's a great question. Certain major product changes might lead to potentially losing customers. And any tips to keep in mind when you're preparing for that type of outcome?
Yeah, I think that one's really a great one. So you're making a decision maybe to divest from a certain product group or a product feature, or maybe to sell it. That might lead to your customers leaving. So first is, how can you project how many of those customers you want to try and retain? If you know that this decision is going to impact retention, can you manage how much impact that has on retention? Can you scale it up or down? Can you translate it over time? But it's never easy to make that decision, and might cause you customers to lose. The other thing is to frame it in the sense of balance. So if you're making a decision and there's rationale behind it, how is that going to help grow maybe loyalty of your current customer base and improve the monthly spend that they have to balance out the potential loss or attrition of your customer base? So if you're balancing out retention and attrition with the decisions you're making, that's also a good approach.
And what about when you're a small team and the portfolio is quite wide? So what are your thoughts on change prioritization in that case?
Yeah, so I think there's one person here who might be the only PMM, and I might go to say something about like the time that they're spending at conferences versus working with 14 maybe product managers as a team of one, and I've definitely been in those shoes before. So as a small team, when you're balancing a lot of different teams, and we're spread pretty thin as well. Like I work with 14 product managers. I've worked with 6. It's never easy. And I think it's about building a framework to give yourself that prioritization and getting alignment on that framework. So if you are working with a ton of different products and they're all going through changes or maybe launches, understanding your launch framework of what's a P1, P2, or P3 launch, how do you define that, and getting alignment on that framework, or change, like what's a P1 change versus a P3 change, and then going back and saying, okay, with product marketers, with executives, this is the importance of this change, or this is the urgency of this change, this is where it sits in terms of our plan, and then I think you have that framing and discussion, but it gives you a starting point that everyone's aligned on. Yeah.
Great. All right, time for one more question. What's the best way to institute change when something might be so new that there's not a lot of data to back it up?
Yeah, so I guess this could mean, if someone wants to elaborate, that'd be awesome, but maybe you're launching a new product, and you're not sure if it actually works. This is based on a hypothesis. Maybe you're just trying to get people bought into a beta to show that there's value. But again, you don't have a lot of data to show that it's valuable. I think there's a couple of things. You can use proxies. So whether that's something similar that's been done elsewhere, and show how that led to great outcomes for a brand or for that company. Start small, test and trial it. So if you're not sure if reducing the transactional communications from your brand is going to have a big impact, try it with like an alpha group, a small customer base, and see what happens in an experiment like that. If you don't have time, that can be challenging, but it's definitely hard when you don't have the data, and especially if you're trying to communicate why a change should or should not be made. But I think this also comes down to as product marketers, we have to build relationships across different teams. There's sales enablement and product leaders next door. There's literally next door. There's data leaders. There's sales operations leaders. And when you're able to build those relationships, especially when we're onboarding remotely, which a lot of us are, and starting new jobs, those relationships will come back in handy tenfold when you're trying to prove a decision is right or wrong, especially when those people might own the data that you need.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elon. Everyone give it up for Elon.
Thank you.
Thanks.